reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 9 through 17. As Adonai has loved me, so have I loved you. Live on in my love. And you will live on in my love if you keep my commandments, just as I live on in Adonai God's love and have kept God's commandments. I tell you all this, that my joy may be yours, and your joy may be complete. This is my commandment: love one another as I have loved you. There is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. And you are my friends, if you do what I command you. I no longer speak to you as subordinates, because a subordinate doesn't know a superior's business. Instead, I call you friends, because I have made known to you everything I have learned from God. It was not you who chose me, it was I who chose you to go forth and bear fruit. Your fruit must endure, so that whatever you ask of Adonai God in my name, God will give you. This command I give you, that you love one another.
Abide in my love, Jesus says. Today, Jesus tells us that if we abide in love, we abide in him. Through him, we abide in the parent God that loves us so whole, despite those times we may feel disconnected from God's self. God as parent created us so that we can be community, as a result of the Trinity with one another, just as God the Creator is in community with God the Sustainer and God the Redeemer. In fact, when we look at the community of the Trinity, we find ourselves looking at the whole of God: parent, child, and divine presence. So when I first discovered church and what church could be, I was amazed by the abiding love that feels so incredibly grace-filled. Back when I lived in Pittsfield, I had my first connection with a pastor who, to this day, abides in love for me. One day, I happened upon this large community garden. This garden must have been about the size of an Olympic swimming pool. It straddled a driveway leading up to an apparently large warehouse-like building. One day, I decided to check it out. As I drove up that long driveway, I parked in the lot adjacent to that big warehouse of a building. As I walked to the garden, I realized that the building was actually a church. It was a church affiliated with the Church of Christ. I was a bit thrown off and nervous by the church, wondering what ulterior motive they might have for growing such a huge garden in front of their church. I questioned their motives simply because they were a Church of Christ, which I knew to be very different from my own United Church of Christ. And all I knew was that those Church of Christ people were often very conservative and really evangelical. As I headed to the garden, I noticed a man was working there. I approached him and asked him if he belonged to this church. He said, "I'm the pastor of this church. What can I help you with?" I told him that I worked for the local hospital, managing several community gardens in the area. I explained to him that recently I discovered his garden while I was driving through the neighborhood. As a result of my position with the hospital, I explained that I was impressed by its size and wondered more about the ways in which this community garden served the community. As we continued our conversation, I helped him with the weeds and the watering. Somewhere in the conversation, I asked him about his church and about his denomination. He shared a lot of his own theology and asked me about mine. I remember hesitating as I shared my own religious views and experiences with him. Upon asking me why I was so hesitant to share all of this with him, I told him that I was actually raised Jewish, and I had come across some pretty overzealous evangelists in my life. I went on to explain that many of these evangelists that I had come across were quite forceful in their attempts to convert me. I always felt in my interactions with them that I was somehow bound for hell and eternal damnation. As I shared some stories with him, he smiled and he nodded knowingly. At the time, I felt so confident that he was not like the others. And it became very quickly apparent that I was right. He was very different. So I stopped reading and I asked him, "Why aren't you like that?" His response was, "I want to nurture people. That is why I started this garden. For me, church is about nurture, and I want to lead a place of love, nurture, and tender, loving care." To this day, I'm still in touch with him. He still sends me notes of pastoral love, and to this day, I see him as one who has been pastor to me. He taught me what church should be like, and I believe that this particular pastor abides in love, as outlined in today's scripture reading. When I attend church, I look for the love and sense of beloved community shared between pastor and parishioners. Because being pastor is not about judgment. Being pastor is leading and teaching a congregation to be better, to do better, and to love more and more. Likewise, being parishioner is not about judgment, but rather welcoming all children of God to the table. After all, God calls us friends, not servants. When God expresses a deep connection to humanity by committing to friendship with the disciples, God is outlining the way church is church, the way church should be, and the church should be a place of friendship. As this week's reading implies, we should love as God has loved us, to love one another wholeheartedly. There is no love greater than the love and grace God extends to us. Now, I cannot claim to know whether my Pittsfield pastor disagrees with my transition or questions my gender identity. For all I know, he might think that my transition is a lifestyle or a phase. That is between him and God. And I believe that he leaves that between him and God in his conversations with God. I have found that it feels as though he feels and loves me in the way that God has commanded of him. Often, I find myself reflecting on the love that my Pittsfield pastor taught me about. The same love that teaches me that if this conservative, evangelical pastor can love me enough to grant me the respect and dignity that he does, I can grant others, unlike me, the same. See, when I think of MCC Boston, I think of a congregation that welcomes sexual minorities of all perspectives and experiences. There is a power in love, nurture, and tender loving care here, isn't there? But what are we missing in our welcome? How can we begin to establish practices that are all the more inclusive? Because friends, these times are changing. Let's talk about gender minorities because this is a conversation that is only beginning. It is only beginning for many whose identities do not fit within the male and female binary. It is only the beginning for communities in Boston, in Massachusetts, for MCC, and in the United States, and certainly this world. So you see, if my conservative evangelical pastor can honor me, why am I coming up with excuses not to honor those that claim gender-neutral pronouns? After all, every single human being is born in God's image. That means I must honor those that use language that is beyond male and female. They are people of God, and they are created by God. So that's the first thing we can do. When people walk through those doors, how is MCC Boston welcoming them? In my experience, most communities have a good firm grasp around sexual orientation, but approaching gender diversity is still difficult for many. A few weeks ago, Mark Mell expressed a desire to learn about how MCC Boston can be more inclusive of those who do not use male pronouns or female pronouns, but rather all the new pronouns. I think the most positive and loving welcome that we could provide would come with being a church that allows them to self-identify and for people to, with no excuses or explanations, honor the preferred gender pronouns that people identify for themselves. We have started doing that with the stickers. We need to be conscious about the ways in which we refer to one another. That's a fact. It is difficult to reframe the way we read the world, to see beyond simple male and female pronouns. It is difficult even for me, but we must if we want to continue to be the church of radical inclusion. I'm actually ashamed at how I failed to be an ally to my gender minority siblings. Even I had to be conscious of people's preferred gender pronouns. Early on, I had to remind people that my preferred gender pronouns are male. I still often do. Sometimes I feel, and I have felt, that when people failed to use male pronouns for me, they were essentially saying that they were not going to honor who I was and who I was created to be and who I identified as. As a result, I have found myself to be ever conscious of these new pronouns when someone shares that they are, in fact, non-binary, that they use gender-neutral pronouns like they, them, theirs, or like she, them, and theirs. I could go on and on about these many gender-neutral pronouns. I have to consciously, mindfully think of people in their whole human experience, even if I do not fully understand their personal experience of gender. It is my duty as a friend, not a servant, to love and honor others as myself. As a church, MCC Boston can be more inclusive by encouraging that all people include their gender pronouns each week on their name tag. When I first came out, my pronouns changed a lot. I used neutral ones, female ones, male ones, depending on how comfortable I was in the community I was in. When a community as a whole showed the importance of all labeling their pronouns, that there would be no assumptions made, that is when I felt like I was in a place of love, nurture, and tender loving care. It is important to allow for self-identification week after week and to not make gender permanent. This is how we love each other and recognize God in one another. This does bring me to another way we can welcome all who are made beautifully in God's image. Forever, the larger church has used male pronouns for God. If we are all made in God's image, who are we excluding? By only using male pronouns, we're excluding women and people who don't identify as either. By even only using female pronouns, we are excluding men and those that don't identify as either. It is as if we have turned away God's children that live outside of the binary. We place limitations on God. I may identify as male and others may identify as female. There are children of God who identify in between. Once folks walk through the door, does not stop at self-identification and honoring what others tell themselves. Church needs to be a place that expresses the diversity of humanity in our expressions of divinity. We need to recognize the female, masculine, neutral tendencies of God, all of them, in order for people to see themselves as part of the kingdom. We need to be using language that conveys that God is their creator, that they are created too in God's image. So when we pray, or when we think of God publicly, let's use other words, not just the male and female pronouns. Let's use she, them, theirs, not just he, him, or his. Let's use words like thee, them, and hers. Let's begin to reflect the vast diversity of God's image in which she created us. After all, the mission statement for MCC's denomination says that we endeavor to build bridges that liberate and unite voices of sacred defiance. We lead from the margins, and we transform. These are new margins. So may MCC Boston continue to be the church with a radical, loving welcome. Amen.